Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. Richard's paradox. In 1905, the French mathematician Jules Richard discovered a paradox that strikes at the heart of how language and mathematics interact, revealing that certain kinds of definitions can generate contradictions no matter how carefully they're constructed. Consider the set of all real numbers that can be defined in a finite number of words using the English language. And this set seems reasonable at first because most numbers we ever think about can be described in some way. Pi is the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. The square root of 2 is the length of the diagonal of a unit square, and so on. Since there are only finitely many words in the English language and only finitely many ways to arrange them into sentences of any given length, there can only be countably many such descriptions, which means there are only countably many real numbers that can be defined in this way. Yet the real numbers are uncountable, as Georg Cantor proved, which means there must exist real numbers that cannot be defined in any finite number of English words, numbers that are forever beyond the reach of language, numbers that exist but cannot be named or described or pointed to in any way. Now comes the paradox. Consider the real number defined as follows. Let it be the first real number in the set of all real numbers that cannot be defined in a finite number of English words, arranged in some standard ordering, such as numerical order. This definition appears to successfully define a specific real number, and the definition itself uses only a finite number of English words, which means the number it defines belongs to the set of numbers that can be defined in a finite number of words, but the definition explicitly states that the number belongs to the set of numbers that cannot be defined in a finite number of words, and so the contradiction emerges, sharp and unavoidable. If the number can be defined, then it does not belong to the set of undefinable numbers, but the definition picks it out precisely as a member of that set. And if it cannot be defined, then the definition fails to refer to anything at all. And yet the definition seems perfectly coherent, grammatically correct, and mathematically precise. Richard's paradox exposes a fundamental problem with the concept of definability, the idea that we can cleanly separate describable objects from indescribable ones, because the act of describing the indescribable creates a loop that collapses into contradiction. Some logicians argue that the phrase cannot be defined in a finite number of words is itself vague or improperly formalized, that it mixes informal natural language with formal mathematical concepts in a way that generates confusion, and that a more rigorous treatment would prevent the paradox from arising. Others suggest that the paradox reveals a hierarchy in language, that definitions must be made within specific formal systems, and that talking about all possible definitions requires stepping outside the system into a meta-language, and that mixing these levels is where the contradiction appears. Alfred Tarski developed this idea into a full theory of truth and definability, showing that no language can fully express its own semantic concepts without risking paradox, that truth and definability must always be relativized to a particular formal system, and that higher order languages are needed to talk about lower order ones. Richard's paradox also influenced the development of computability theory, because the question of whether a number can be defined in a finite number of words is closely related to whether it can be computed by a finite algorithm, and paradoxes like Richard's helped clarify the distinction between computable and non-computable reals. The paradox remains a haunting reminder that language, even mathematical language, has limits, that not everything that exists can be captured in words, and that the boundary between the describable and the indescribable is not as stable as it first appears. The bald man paradox. A man stands before a mirror, his hair full and thick, and no one would call him bald, this much is certain. And yet time passes and hairs fall, one by one, slowly at first and then with gathering speed. And the question that haunts philosophers is simple and unanswerable. At what precise moment does this man become bald, after which single hair crosses the threshold from not bald to bald? And the intuition rebels against the idea that one hair could make such a difference, that the removal of a single strand could transform a person's category, could change a truth about them in such a fundamental way. The bald man paradox is a version of the Sorites paradox, focused specifically on baldness, but illustrating the same underlying problem about vagueness, boundaries, and the limits of classification. And it asks us to consider whether baldness admits of sharp boundaries, or whether it is inherently vague, a matter of degree rather than kind. And if it is vague, then how can we use the term meaningfully? How can we say that someone is bald or not bald when there seems to be no clear line separating the two states? Imagine the process in reverse, starting with a completely bald man, hairless and smooth, and now a single hair appears on his head, and surely one hair does not make him not bald. The presence of a single hair is negligible, imperceptible to casual observation, and if one hair does not change baldness, then neither does two, and if two do not, then neither does three, and this reasoning continues, step by step, until the man has a full head of hair, and yet according to the logic he should still be bald because no single hair made the difference, and this conclusion is absurd, and so something must be wrong with the reasoning, but what? The paradox forces a choice between several uncomfortable positions. One option is to accept that there is a sharp boundary, a precise number of hairs that separates bald from not bald, perhaps 10,000 hairs or 5,000 or some other specific number, and anyone with fewer hairs than this threshold is bald, while anyone with more is not bald. And this view preserves classical logic, maintains that every statement is either true or false, that vagueness is merely epistemic, a matter of our ignorance about where the true boundary lies, but this position strikes many as implausible because it seems arbitrary. There is no principled reason why 10,000 hairs should be the cutoff rather than 10,001, and the idea that baldness depends on such a precise count feels wrong, disconnected from how we actually use the term. Another option is to reject the idea of sharp boundaries and embrace the view that baldness is genuinely vague, that there are borderline cases where it is neither determinately true nor determinately false that someone is bald, cases where the world itself does not settle the question, and this view requires abandoning or modifying classical logic, accepting that by valence, the principle that every proposition is either true or false does not hold for vague predicates, and this leads to various non-classical logical systems, three-valued logics where propositions can be true, false or indeterminate, fuzzy logics where truth comes in degrees ranging continuously from 0 to 1, supervaluationism where a statement is true if it is true on all acceptable ways of making the vague term precise, and each of these approaches has costs and benefits. Each preserves some intuitions while sacrificing others. A third option is contextualism, the view that whether someone is bald depends on the context of utterance, on the standards and purposes operative in a given conversation or situation. And in one context, a man with 5,000 hairs might count as bald, while in another context only someone with fewer than 1,000 hairs would count. And this view makes baldness relative rather than absolute. And it explains why borderline cases feel uncertain, because in borderline cases the context has not provided enough information to determine which standards apply, but contextualism faces challenges too. It must explain how context determines standards, whether there are constraints on what standards can be operative, and whether contextualism avoids the Sorites paradox or merely relocates it to the question of when contexts shift. The bald man paradox also connects to broader questions about language, reference, and the relationship between words and the world. Because if most predicates in natural language are vague, and they are, nearly every adjective and many nouns admit of borderline cases, then vagueness is not a peripheral issue, but a central feature of how we communicate, and any theory of meaning must account for it, must explain how. Vague terms can be useful and informative despite their lack of sharp boundaries, and must address whether vagueness is a feature of language, of thought, of the world, or of all three. Some philosophers argue that vagueness is purely linguistic, that the world itself is precise and determinate, but our words are blunt instruments that fail to carve reality at its joints, while others suggest that vagueness exists in thought as well, that our concepts are themselves fuzzy, and still others propose that the world itself contains vague objects and properties, that reality does not always come with sharp boundaries, that nature is continuous and gradual in ways that resist precise classification. The paradox has practical implications as well. In law, where terms like reasonable and substantial and significant must be applied to real cases despite their vagueness. In medicine, where diagnostic criteria often involve thresholds that are somewhat arbitrary. In ethics, where drawing lines between permissible and impermissible actions may require confronting borderline cases where intuition provides no clear guidance. And in each of these domains, the bald man paradox is not merely an abstract puzzle, but a genuine obstacle to clear thinking and fair judgment. The paradox also raises questions about personal identity and change over time. Because if baldness is gradual, then so are many other properties, aging, growing, learning, and if there are no sharp transitions, then perhaps personal change is also vague. Perhaps there are cases where it is indeterminate whether someone is the same person they were years ago, whether they have changed in significant ways or remained essentially the same. And this connects to deeper issues about persistence, continuity, and what it means to endure through time. The bald man stands as a symbol of all borderline cases, all situations where reality resists the either-or structure of classical logic, where predicates fade gradually from clear application to clear non-application, passing through a twilight zone where truth becomes uncertain, and the paradox endures because it exposes a tension between the precision we expect from rational thought and the vagueness inherent in the world and in language, and no solution has won universal acceptance. Philosophers continue to debate whether to accept sharp boundaries, revise logic, relativize truth to context, or adopt some more radical approach. And the bald man remains poised between categories. Neither clearly bald nor clearly not bald in the borderline cases, a living embodiment of the limits of definition, a reminder that the world does not always cooperate with our desire for clarity, and that some questions may have no determinate answer, not because we lack knowledge, but because the questions themselves presuppose a precision that reality does not provide. And the hairs fall one by one, and baldness approaches, and no single hair marks the moment of transformation, and the paradox persists, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, a permanent feature of the conceptual landscape we must navigate, a crack in the foundations of logic that cannot be sealed. The Allais paradox. Maurice Allais, a French economist and Nobel laureate, presented a pair of choices in 1953 that revealed a systematic pattern of preferences violating the independence axiom of expected utility theory, and this became known as the Allais paradox, one of the most influential demonstrations that human decision-making deviates from the prescriptions of standard rational choice theory. And the paradox shows that people's preferences can be influenced by irrelevant alternatives, by outcomes that occur in both options and should therefore cancel out, yet somehow affect which option is chosen. The first choice involves two lotteries. Lottery A offers a certain gain of $1 million, while lottery B offers a 10% chance of winning $5 million, an 89% chance of winning $1 million, and a 1% chance of winning nothing. And when faced with this choice, most people prefer lottery A, the certain million, preferring the sure thing to the gamble, even though the gamble has a higher expected value. And this preference reflects risk aversion, a common and generally accepted feature of human decision-making. The second choice involves two different lotteries. Lottery C offers an 11% chance of winning $1 million and an 89% chance of winning nothing, while Lottery D offers a 10% chance of winning $5 million and a 90% chance of winning nothing. And when faced with this choice, most people prefer Lottery D, the gamble with the higher potential payoff, accepting the slightly lower probability of winning in exchange for the much larger prize. The paradox emerges when these two preference patterns are analysed together, because the independence axiom of expected utility theory requires that if Lottery A is preferred to Lottery B, then Lottery C should be preferred to Lottery D. And the reason is that Lotteries A and B differ from Lotteries C and D only in that there is an 89% chance in both A and B of receiving $1 million, and in both C and D this 89% outcome is replaced with winning nothing, and this replacement should affect both lotteries equally, should not change the preference order, because the independence axiom says that preferences between lotteries should depend only on outcomes where the lotteries differ, not on outcomes that are the same in both. And the 89% probability mass is shifted in the same way for both pairs, and so if you prefer A to B, you should also prefer C to D. And if you prefer D to C, you should also prefer B to A. The typical pattern of preferences, A over B and D over C, cannot be represented by any utility function satisfying the expected utility axioms. And so the Allais paradox demonstrates that people systematically violate the independence axiom, that their preferences are sensitive to common outcomes in ways that expected utility theory does not permit. And this violation is robust, appearing in experiments with diverse populations, with real monetary stakes, with careful experimental design, and the paradox cannot be dismissed as error or confusion, but represents a genuine feature of human decision-making. The paradox has inspired alternative theories that can accommodate the observed preferences, including prospect theory, developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, which modifies expected utility theory by introducing reference points, by treating gains and losses differently, by allowing for probability weighting where people overweight small probabilities and underweight large probabilities. And these modifications can explain the Allais preferences, because in the first choice, the certainty of $1 million receives extra weight, making Lottery A more attractive, while in the second choice the small probabilities are overweighted, making the 10% chance of $5 million in Lottery D seem more appealing than the 11% chance of $1 million in Lottery C. Other theories include regret theory, where people anticipate the regret they would feel if they made the wrong choice. And this anticipated regret influences preferences in ways that violate independence, because the certain million in Lottery A avoids the regret of choosing the gamble and losing everything, while the choices between C and D do not have this asymmetry. And rank-dependent utility theory, which generalizes expected utility by allowing the utility of lotteries to depend not just on outcomes and probabilities, but on the rank ordering of outcomes, and this allows for preferences that violate independence while maintaining other desirable properties. The Allais paradox raises normative questions about rationality. Some argue that the independence axiom is a fundamental requirement of rational choice, that violating it leads to incoherence, to preferences that can be exploited through Dutch books or money pumps, to decision-making that is systematically suboptimal, and that people who exhibit Allais preferences are making mistakes and should revise their preferences to conform to expected utility theory. While others argue that the independence axiom, while mathematically convenient, is not a necessary condition for rationality, that it does not capture important aspects of how people value uncertain prospects, that preferences like those in the alley paradox reflect legitimate concerns about certainty, regret, and the context of choice, and that we should revise our normative theories to accommodate these preferences rather than dismissing them as irrational. The paradox also has practical implications for economics and policy, because if people systematically violate independence, then markets may not function as standard theory predicts. Risk preferences may be context-dependent. Insurance and investment decisions may be influenced by framing effects, and policies designed to maximize expected utility may not align with what people actually prefer. And understanding these deviations from expected utility helps explain phenomena like the equity premium puzzle, the disposition effect, and other anomalies in financial markets and economic behavior. The lotteries sit before you, the choices must be made, and your preferences, revealed through your choices, tell a story about how you value certainty and risk, about how you weigh probabilities and outcomes, and the story violates the axioms of rational choice, violates the clean mathematical structure of expected utility theory, and yet the choices feel reasonable, feel justified, feel like they reflect something important about value and uncertainty that the theory misses, and the paradox persists. The gap between theory and behavior remains. The independence axiom is violated again and again in experiments and in life, and decision theorists must choose. Either insist that the axiom is normatively binding and that violators are irrational, or acknowledge that the axiom is too strong, that rational choice is more complex than expected utility allows, and that new theories are needed to capture the richness of human decision-making. And the Allais paradox remains a landmark, a decisive demonstration that classical rational choice theory does not fully describe or prescribe human behavior, a challenge that spawned new theories and new research programs, and a reminder that rationality is contested, that what counts as a reasonable choice depends on assumptions and frameworks that are themselves open to question, and the lotteries remain, the choices remain, the preferences remain, and the paradox endures, unsolved in the sense that no consensus has emerged about whether the preferences are rational or irrational, about whether we should revise our theories or our preferences, about whether independence is a negotiable axiom or a non-negotiable requirement. And the debate continues. Philosophers and economists and psychologists arguing about what rationality requires, about what humans actually do, and about the relationship between these two questions. Skolem's paradox. Set theory describes infinite sets of different sizes, and Georg Cantor proved that the real numbers are uncountably infinite, that they cannot be placed in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, that there are more real numbers than natural numbers, and this is one of the foundational results of modern mathematics, a theorem that establishes a hierarchy of infinities. But Thoralf Skolem discovered a paradox, or what appears to be a paradox, that threatens this result. And the paradox is that any consistent first-order theory that has an infinite model also has a countable model, a model where the domain consists of only countably many elements. And this is the Löwenheim-Skolem theorem, and applying it to set theory yields a troubling conclusion. If set theory is consistent, then it has a countable model, a model where the universe of sets is countably infinite. And yet within this model, the axioms of set theory are satisfied, including Cantor's theorem, which proves that the real numbers are uncountable. And so we have a countable model of set theory in which there exists an uncountable set. And this seems contradictory. How can a set be uncountable if the entire universe is countable? How can there be more real numbers than natural numbers if the whole model has only countably many elements? And this is Skolem's paradox. The resolution lies in understanding the distinction between internal and external perspectives, between how things appear from inside the model and how they appear from outside, From inside the countable model of set theory, all the axioms hold. Cantor's theorem is provable. The real numbers have no enumeration within the model. No bijection between the reals and the naturals exists as far as the model is concerned, and so internally the reals are uncountable. But from outside the model, from the perspective of someone who can see the entire structure, the model itself has only countably many elements, and there exists a bijection between the elements of the model and the natural numbers. A bijection that is not itself an element of the model, that does not correspond to any set or function within the model. And so externally, the model is countable. And this distinction between internal and external is the key to resolving the paradox. Uncountability is relative. It depends on what bijections are available, and different models have different bijections. Scolam's paradox reveals something profound about the nature of mathematical existence and the limits of first-order logic. It shows that first-order logic cannot pin down the cardinality of infinite sets, that the concept of uncountability is not absolute but relative to a model, that what counts as uncountable in one model may be countable in another, and this relativity is a consequence of the expressive limitations of first-order logic, which can only quantify over elements of the domain, not over arbitrary functions or sets of elements, and so first-order set theory cannot express the existence of a bijection between two sets in an absolute way, cannot say, in a model-independent manner, that a set is countable or uncountable. Some philosophers and logicians find this relativity troubling, a sign that first-order set theory is inadequate as a foundation for mathematics, that a stronger logic, perhaps second-order logic, which allows quantification over sets and functions, is needed to capture the intended meaning of set-theoretic concepts. And in second-order logic, the Löwenheim-Skolem theorem does not hold. There are categorical characterizations of structures, including characterizations of the natural numbers and the real numbers that pin down their cardinality uniquely, and so second-order logic avoids Skolem's paradox by being more expressive, by allowing statements that distinguish countable from uncountable models. But second-order logic has its own difficulties. It lacks complete proof systems. There is no algorithmic procedure that can, in principle, prove all second-order truths, and so the gain in expressiveness comes at the cost of losing some of the nice logical properties that first-order logic enjoys. Others embrace the relativity revealed by Skolem's paradox, arguing that it shows the conventional or perspectival nature of mathematical concepts, that cardinality is not an intrinsic property of sets but a relation between sets and models, that what we call uncountable is simply a set that lacks an enumeration within a particular model, and that different models can disagree about what is countable without any of them being wrong. And this perspective aligns with a pluralistic or model-theoretic approach to mathematics, where there is no single intended model of set theory, but many models, each with its own internal structure, and what is true varies from model to model, and mathematical truth is relative to a choice of model. Skolem's paradox also connects to issues about the definiteness of the continuum, about whether the set of real numbers has a well-defined cardinality, and the continuum hypothesis, which asks whether there is a set whose cardinality is strictly between that of the natural numbers and the real numbers. And this hypothesis is independent of the standard axioms of set theory, meaning that neither the hypothesis nor its negation can be proven from the axioms. And some mathematicians interpret this independence as evidence that the cardinality of the continuum is not a definite matter of fact, but depends on additional assumptions or on the choice of model. And Skolem's paradox reinforces this interpretation by showing that even the distinction between countable and uncountable is model-dependent. The paradox remains a touchstone in the philosophy of mathematics and the foundations of logic. It illustrates the limits of first-order logic, the relativity of model-theoretic notions, and the gap between formal systems and intended interpretations. And it forces careful thinking about what it means to say that a set is countable or uncountable, about whether mathematical concepts have absolute meanings or are always relative to a framework, and about the relationship between syntactic provability and semantic truth. And the paradox has no simple resolution. Different philosophers and mathematicians draw different lessons, some seeing it as a defect of first-order logic, others as a feature revealing deep truths about the nature of infinity and cardinality. And the debate continues, with implications for how we understand the foundations of mathematics, the status of set theory, and the nature of mathematical truth. The countable model sits in logical space, containing sets and functions and real numbers, and within this model, Cantor's theorem holds. The reals are uncountable, no enumeration exists, but from outside the model, the whole structure is countable. All its elements can be listed, and the real numbers of the model, uncountable internally, are countable externally. And this doubling of perspective, this split between internal and external, is the heart of Scolam's paradox, a demonstration that perspective matters, that truth is not always absolute, that models can disagree, and that first-order logic, powerful as it is, cannot capture all the nuances of infinite cardinality. And the paradox endures, a puzzle that has shaped logic and set theory, a challenge that continues to generate discussion and debate, and a reminder that even the most basic mathematical concepts, even the notion of how many, become subtle and contested when applied to infinite collections. Inattentional blindness. Why a gorilla walks through your vision. Unseen. A person watches a video, follows instructions to count how many times basketball players wearing white shirts pass the ball, and they count carefully, focus on the white team, track the passes, and reach a final count. And then they are asked whether they noticed anything unusual, and they say no, nothing unusual, just basketball players passing the ball. And then they watch the video again, this time without counting, and they are shocked to see that a person in a gorilla suit walked through the middle of the scene, stopped in the center, beat their chest, and walked off. And this gorilla was visible for 9 seconds, passed directly through the action, was large and obvious, and yet the person did not see it the first time, was completely unaware, was blind to the gorilla despite looking directly at it. And this is inattentional blindness, demonstrated famously by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabray in their invisible gorilla experiment, a phenomenon showing that attention is necessary for conscious perception, that we can look directly at something and not see it if we are not attending to it. And inattentional blindness reveals that perception is not simply determined by what falls on the retina, but is determined by what receives attention. And without attention, even salient obvious stimuli can be invisible, can pass unnoticed. And this challenges the idea that we consciously perceive everything in our visual field, shows that consciousness is limited to attended stimuli, and inattentional blindness has profound implications for understanding attention, consciousness, and the limits of awareness. Imagine the experience from the inside. You're focused on counting passes, tracking the white shirts, following the ball as it moves, and your attention is fully engaged, is consumed by the counting task. And the gorilla walks through, but you do not notice it. It does not register, does not enter consciousness. And the reason is that your attention is elsewhere, is focused on the white team. And the gorilla is not relevant to the task, is not expected, is not attended to. And without attention, the gorilla remains unconscious, remains invisible, despite being visible in the sense that the image falls on your retina, that your eyes are open and pointing at it. And this distinction between seeing with the eyes and seeing with attention reveals that conscious vision requires more than physical stimulation, requires attention, requires that processing reach a certain level. And inattentional blindness shows what happens when this does not occur, shows that stimuli can be physically present but mentally absent. Inattentional blindness differs from change blindness in that it occurs even without the need for comparison, occurs for stimuli that are continuously present, not just for changes, and the phenomenon shows that attention operates not just to encode changes, but to enable any conscious perception. And when attention is fully engaged elsewhere, when there is no spare attentional capacity, even salient, unexpected stimuli are not processed to the level of consciousness. And this demonstrates that attention is a limited resource, cannot be allocated to everything simultaneously. And when fully allocated to one task, nothing else reaches awareness, and the gorilla illustrates this dramatically, is an unexpected, salient stimulus that should capture attention, that would capture attention under normal circumstances. But when attention is fully engaged in counting passes, the gorilla is filtered out, is processed pre-consciously, but does not reach awareness. Visualize attention as a gate, and stimuli must pass through the gate to reach consciousness, and the gate is narrow, allows only a limited number of stimuli through, and when the gate is occupied by task-relevant stimuli, by the white-shirted players and the ball, irrelevant stimuli like the gorilla are blocked, are filtered out, and processing of the gorilla stops at an early stage, extracts basic features, but does not construct a conscious representation, and the gorilla remains invisible. And this gating model explains inattentional blindness, explains why stimuli that are physically present can be perceptually absent, because consciousness requires passing through the attentional gate, and only attended stimuli pass through. Inattentional blindness has practical implications for understanding accidents, for recognizing that drivers can look directly at pedestrians or other vehicles and not see them if attention is focused elsewhere. And looking is not the same as seeing. Vision requires attention, and when attention is engaged with navigation or conversation or phone use, stimuli outside the focus of attention can be missed, and this contributes to accidents, to collisions that seem inexplicable because the driver was looking, had clear sight lines, but did not see, did not notice the hazard. And understanding inattentional blindness is crucial for improving road safety, for recognizing the limits of human perception, and for designing systems that account for these limits. The phenomenon also has implications for understanding consciousness, for debates about whether consciousness requires attention, whether you can be conscious of unattended stimuli, and inattentional blindness suggests that consciousness requires attention, that unattended stimuli are not conscious, are processed unconsciously, and consciousness is limited to the small set of attended stimuli. And this supports the view that consciousness is sparse, is not the rich field of awareness we subjectively experience, but is a narrow spotlight that illuminates only what attention selects. And the subjective richness is an illusion, is created by the fact that attention moves rapidly, samples different regions, and wherever it lands, detail emerges. And we confuse this serial sampling with parallel richness, assume that because detail is available everywhere, it must be present everywhere. But inattentional blindness shows this is false, shows that unattended regions are not conscious, are invisible, even when physically visible. One response to inattentional blindness argues that some stimuli do capture attention automatically, do break through even when attention is engaged elsewhere, and highly salient or biologically significant stimuli like your own name or threatening faces or sudden loud noises capture attention, override current focus, and enter awareness. And this suggests that inattentional blindness is not absolute, is not a complete gate that blocks all unattended stimuli, but is a selective filter that allows some stimuli through based on salience and relevance. And the gorilla, while salient, is not personally relevant, not threatening, not expected, and so does not capture attention, does not override the counting task. And this response preserves some role for stimulus-driven attention, while acknowledging that inattentional blindness demonstrates the dominance of goal-directed attention. Another implication concerns legal contexts, concerns eyewitness testimony, and the reliability of visual reports. Because if people can miss large obvious stimuli like gorillas when attention is engaged elsewhere, then eyewitnesses can miss critical details of crimes, can fail to notice perpetrators or weapons or actions even when looking directly at the scene. And this challenges the assumption that eyewitnesses see everything, that memory failures are due to forgetting rather than to never encoding. And inattentional blindness shows that encoding requires attention, and attention is limited, and eyewitnesses cannot be expected to have noticed everything, and testimony must be evaluated with this in mind, must recognize the limits of attention and perception. The gorilla walks through the frame, visible and obvious, and yet unseen, unnoticed, invisible, due to inattention, due to the focus on counting passes, and the phenomenon reveals that consciousness requires attention, that seeing requires more than physical stimulation, requires cognitive engagement, requires processing resources that are limited, and when fully allocated elsewhere, nothing else reaches awareness, and the gorilla remains hidden. Hidden not by camouflage or occlusion, but by inattention, by the filter that protects consciousness from overload, that selects what matters and ignores the rest. And inattentional blindness endures as one of the most striking demonstrations in psychology, a phenomenon that challenges naive assumptions about perception, that shows the limits of awareness, that reveals consciousness as sparse and selective, and the gorilla continues to walk unseen through countless viewings, invisible to half the viewers, shocking to those who missed it, and the phenomenon persists, demonstrating that attention is the gateway to consciousness, and without attention, even gorillas are invisible. Gabriel's horn paradox, a three-dimensional solid of revolution, is formed by taking the curve y equals 1 over x, for x greater than or equal to 1, and rotating it around the x-axis, and this creates a shape that resembles a horn or a trumpet, wide at one end near x equals 1, and tapering endlessly as x increases toward infinity, growing ever narrower but never closing, extending infinitely far in one direction. And this shape is called Gabriel's horn, named after the archangel whose trumpet signals the end of days. And the paradox is that this infinite horn has finite volume but infinite surface area. And this seems contradictory, or at least deeply strange, because if the volume is finite, then you could fill the horn with a finite amount of paint, but if the surface area is infinite, then you would need an infinite amount of paint to coat the surface. And so, it seems that you can fill the horn, but cannot paint it. And this apparent impossibility is Gabriel's horn paradox. The mathematics is straightforward. The volume of the horn is calculated using the formula for volumes of revolution, integrating from 1 to infinity the area of circular cross-sections. And the cross-section at position x has radius 1 over x, and so the area is pi times 1 over x squared. And integrating this from 1 to infinity gives pi a finite volume, meaning the horn could contain pi cubic units of liquid. And the surface area is calculated using the formula for surface area of revolution, integrating the circumference of each cross-section multiplied by an element of arc length. And this integral diverges. It grows without bound as the upper limit of integration increases, and so the surface area is infinite. And this combination, finite volume and infinite surface area, is what creates the paradox. The resolution of the paradox lies in recognizing that paint, as a physical substance, has thickness. It is not a mathematical surface with zero thickness, but a three-dimensional coating. And if the paint has any positive thickness, however small, then painting the inside of the horn requires filling a three-dimensional region, not just covering a surface, and the volume of this region is finite because it is contained within the horn, which has finite volume, and so a finite amount of paint suffices to coat the inside to any specified thickness, and the paradox dissolves. The apparent impossibility is an artifact of treating paint as if it were a zero-thickness mathematical surface, when in reality it is a substance with volume. Another way to see the resolution is to note that the distinction between filling and painting is not as sharp as it seems. Filling the horn means occupying its entire interior volume, while painting the surface means adding a thin layer. But if the layer has thickness, then painting is a form of filling a thin shell around the surface, and since the horn has finite volume, any shell within it also has finite volume, and so painting, properly understood, requires only a finite amount of paint. And the paradox arises from conflating mathematical surface area, which can be infinite, with physical coating, which requires volume, and volume is finite. Gabriel's horn also raises questions about the nature of infinity in geometry, about what it means for a geometric object to be infinite, and whether infinite objects can have finite properties, and the horn shows that they can. That infinite extent in one dimension, length, is compatible with finite extent in another dimension, volume, and this is not unique to the horn. Many geometric objects exhibit similar behavior: infinite regions with finite area, infinite surfaces with finite curvature. And these examples show that infinity is not a single uniform concept, but comes in degrees and dimensions, and that intuitions about finite objects do not always transfer to infinite objects. The paradox also appears in discussions of limits and convergence, because the volume integral converges to a finite value, while the surface area integral diverges. And this difference reflects the rates at which the integrands decrease as x increases. The volume integral decreases like 1 over x squared, fast enough that the sum over an infinite range is finite, while the surface area integral decreases like 1 over x, not fast enough to produce a finite sum. And this distinction between different rates of decay is central to analysis and calculus, determining which infinite series converge and which diverge, which integrals are finite and which are infinite. Some philosophers and mathematicians have used Gabriel's horn to argue about the nature of mathematical existence, about whether infinite objects like the horn really exist or are merely useful fictions, because the horn cannot be physically realized. No physical material extends infinitely, and no physical process could construct an infinite shape. And so, the horn is an idealization, a mathematical abstraction, and the paradox, if it is one, is a feature of this abstraction rather than a claim about physical reality. And this raises the question of whether mathematical paradoxes reveal truths about an independent mathematical realm or merely expose the limits of our abstractions and idealizations. Gabriel's horn has also been used in pedagogy to teach students about improper integrals, about the difference between convergence of volume and surface area, about the importance of careful calculation and the dangers of relying on intuition. And the paradox is memorable. It sticks in the mind, a striking example that challenges assumptions and forces students to think carefully about what integration measures and what infinity means. And for these reasons, the horn remains a staple of calculus courses, a classic example that generations of students have encountered and puzzled over. The horn extends to infinity, narrowing as it goes, its volume contained, its surface spreading without bound. And the paradox asks whether this makes sense, whether an object can be filled but not painted. And the answer is that paint has thickness, that coating requires volume, that mathematical surfaces and physical substances are different, and that the paradox is resolved by attending carefully to what filling and painting actually mean. And the horn remains a beautiful and strange geometric object, a shape that embodies the counterintuitive properties of infinity, a reminder that infinite objects do not behave like finite objects scaled up, but follow their own logic, their own rules, and that intuition trained on the finite is an unreliable guide to the infinite. And Gabriel's horn sounds on, infinite in reach but finite in substance, a paradox that is no paradox once understood, a puzzle that teaches about integration, about infinity, about the relationship between mathematical idealization and physical reality, and about the need to distinguish between what can be calculated and what can be realized. between the abstract and the concrete, between the mathematical and the material, and the horn remains, a fixture in mathematics, a lesson in calculus, a paradox that resolves itself once the terms are clarified, once the mathematics is understood, once the nature of paint and surfaces and volume is properly considered, and the paradox fades, leaving behind understanding, leaving behind a deeper appreciation for the subtleties of infinite geometry, and for the care required when reasoning about objects that extend without end. Frankfurt's counterexamples. When you're responsible. Even though you had no choice, a person decides to perform an action, decides on their own, without coercion, based on their own reasons and desires, and they perform the action, and we say they are morally responsible. They acted freely. They deserve praise or blame for what they did. And traditional theories of moral responsibility say that responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise, requires that the person could have chosen differently, that they had genuine alternatives, and this principle, called the principle of alternate possibilities, seems obvious, seems essential to responsibility, because how can you be responsible for an action if you had no choice, if you were forced to do it, if no alternative was possible? And yet philosopher Harry Frankfurt constructed examples that challenge this principle. Examples where a person acts on their own, makes their own decision, but could not have done otherwise, and yet intuitively seems responsible. And these are Frankfurt's counterexamples, thought experiments designed to show that the principle of alternate possibilities is false, that responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise, that what matters is how you acted, whether the action flowed from your own will, not whether you could have acted differently. And Frankfurt's cases have been enormously influential, have reshaped debates about free will and responsibility, have challenged incompatibilist arguments that say determinism undermines responsibility, and the counterexamples remain controversial, remain debated, but have permanently changed the landscape of discussions about freedom. Imagine the example: a person named Jones decides to perform an action, decides to vote for a certain candidate, and Jones makes this decision on his own, based on his own political views, his own deliberation. No one forces him, no one coerces him, and he goes to vote, and he is about to vote for the candidate he chose. And at this moment, unbeknownst to Jones, there is another person, call him Black, who has been monitoring Jones's brain states, and Black has the ability to intervene, to manipulate Jones's brain, to force Jones to vote for the candidate if Jones shows signs of changing his mind. And Black is prepared to intervene, but does not need to, because Jones votes for the candidate on his own, makes the decision himself, and Black's intervention mechanism remains dormant, unused. And the question Frankfurt asks is whether Jones is morally responsible for his vote. And intuitively, the answer is yes. Jones voted based on his own decision, his own reasons. Black's presence made no difference. Black did nothing, and Jones is responsible just as he would be if Black did not exist. And yet Jones could not have done otherwise, because if he had tried to vote differently, Black would have intervened, would have forced him to vote for the candidate. And so Jones had no alternative, could not have avoided voting as he did, and yet he is responsible. And this shows that responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise, that the principle of alternate possibilities is false. The structure of Frankfurt cases involves two elements. The person acts on their own, based on their own will, their own reasons, and there is a counterfactual intervener, someone or something that would have prevented any alternative action, that ensures the person does what they do, but the intervener does not actually act, remains dormant, and so the person's action is their own, even though alternatives were blocked. And Frankfurt argues that what matters for responsibility is not whether alternatives existed, but whether the person acted on their own, whether their action flowed from their own will. And in Frankfurt cases, the action does flow from the person's own will, and so they are responsible even though they could not have done otherwise. Visualize moral responsibility as depending on the actual sequence, on how the action was actually produced, rather than on alternative sequences on what might have happened, and in Frankfurt cases the actual sequence is normal. The person deliberates and chooses and acts, while alternative sequences are blocked by the intervener. And since responsibility depends on the actual sequence, the person is responsible, and the blocked alternatives are irrelevant. And this shows that incompatibilists are wrong to think that determinism, by ruling out alternatives, undermines responsibility, because even if determinism rules out alternatives, as long as people act on their own, based on their own reasons, they are responsible, and responsibility is compatible with determinism. Critics of Frankfurt cases have offered various objections. One objection denies that the person really lacked alternatives, argues that in Frankfurt cases there are flicker alternatives, tiny alternatives, that remain open until the very last moment, moments where the person could begin to choose differently before the intervener stops them, and these flickers are enough to preserve the principle of alternate possibilities, enough to ground responsibility, and so Frankfurt cases do not refute the principle, only show that responsibility does not require robust alternatives, only requires minimal alternatives, tiny flickers of freedom. Another objection questions whether Frankfurt cases really elicit the intuition that the person is responsible, argues that when we imagine the cases carefully, when we recognize that the person truly could not have done otherwise, our intuition of responsibility weakens. And maybe Jones is not fully responsible. Maybe the presence of Black's intervention mechanism, even though unused, affects responsibility, creates a situation where praise and blame are inappropriate, and this response denies that Frankfurt cases generate clear counterexamples, argues that intuitions are unclear or support the principle of alternate possibilities rather than undermining it. A third objection distinguishes between moral responsibility and blameworthiness, argues that Frankfurt cases might show that people can be causally responsible, can be the source of an action, even without alternatives. But this does not show they are morally responsible, does not show they deserve blame or praise, and moral responsibility requires more than being the source of action, requires the ability to do otherwise, requires that the person had control, and Frankfurt cases do not establish moral responsibility, only causal responsibility. Frankfurt has refined his examples over decades, responding to objections, constructing new variants, and the debate continues, with defenders arguing that Frankfurt cases successfully refute the principle of alternate possibilities, show that compatibilism is correct, that responsibility does not require alternatives, and critics arguing that the cases are flawed, that intuitions are unclear, that responsibility does require alternatives after all, and no consensus has emerged. But Frankfurt's contribution is undeniable, has forced philosophers to clarify what responsibility requires, to distinguish between different kinds of freedom, different kinds of control, and to recognize that the relationship between determinism and responsibility is more complex than simple, incompatibilist arguments suggest. Frankfurt's counterexamples also connect to debates about moral luck, about whether responsibility depends on factors beyond our control, because in Frankfurt cases the person is responsible, even though whether alternatives were available was beyond their control, was determined by Black's presence, and this suggests that responsibility is not undermined by factors beyond our control, is not sensitive to luck, and what matters is the actual sequence, how the person actually acted, not whether they were lucky enough to have alternatives. Jones stands in the voting booth, marks his ballot, and Black watches, does nothing, and Jones is responsible, is praised or blamed for his vote, and yet he could not have voted otherwise. And Frankfurt's case challenges traditional assumptions, challenges the principle of alternate possibilities, and forces recognition that responsibility is about actual causation, about whether the person's will was effective, not about whether alternatives existed, and Frankfurt's counterexamples endure as some of the most important thought experiments in philosophy of action, examples that reshaped debates about free will, that challenged incompatibilist arguments, that supported compatibilism, and that remain controversial, remain debated, but have permanently influenced how philosophers think about moral responsibility, about what it requires, about whether determinism threatens it, and the counterexamples persist as permanent features of the landscape, cases that every theory of responsibility must address, must accommodate, or explain away. And Frankfurt's legacy includes these cases, these examples that showed that responsibility might not require what we thought it required, might not depend on alternatives, but on something else, on source, on causation, on whether the action flows from the agent's own will. And the debate continues, and Jones votes, and Black does nothing, and the question remains whether Jones is responsible, and Frankfurt says yes. And the counterexamples stand, challenging, probing, revealing complexity in concepts we thought were simple. Locke's sock paradox. John Locke, the 17th century philosopher, offered a thought experiment about identity and change that has come to be known as Locke's sock paradox, though Locke himself discussed it in the context of broader questions about personal identity and the persistence of objects over time. And the paradox concerns a sock, or in some versions a shoe or a shirt, that is gradually repaired over years until every part of the original has been replaced. And the question arises whether it is still the same sock or whether it has become a different sock. And if it is different, then when did the transformation occur? And this puzzle is closely related to the ship of Theseus, but focuses on everyday objects and the intuitions we have about artifacts, possessions, and the things we use and care about in ordinary life. Imagine a sock that develops a hole, and the hole is darned with new thread, and later another hole appears and is also repaired, and over time the entire sock is patched and repatched, thread by thread, until none of the original material remains. And yet throughout this process the sock has been continuously in use, worn by the same person, stored in the same drawer, and at no point was there a moment when someone discarded one sock and acquired a completely new one. And so there is a strong intuition that it is still the same sock. That identity has been preserved through gradual change. That continuity of use and function matter more than continuity of material. But now consider a variation. Suppose that each time the sock is repaired, the removed material is carefully saved, and eventually someone uses all the original threads to reconstruct a sock, weaving them back together into the original pattern. And now there are two socks, one that has been continuously worn and repaired, containing none of the original material, and one that has been reconstructed from the original material, but which has not been continuously used. And which of these is the original sock? Or are both originals? Or is neither? And different intuitions pull in different directions. Some say the continuously worn sock is the original because it has never ceased to exist, because there is an unbroken chain of identity linking it to the sock that was first worn years ago, while others say the reconstructed sock is the original because it's made of the original material, because material composition is what individuates objects. And still others say that both have some claim to being the original, or that the question has no determinate answer because identity is vague or conventional. Locke used examples like this to explore the conditions of identity over time, arguing that different kinds of things have different criteria for persistence, that a mass of matter is the same mass if it has the same constituent parts, but an artifact like a sock is the same sock if it has the same functional organization, and a living organism is the same organism if it has continuity of life, and a person is the same person if they have continuity of consciousness and memory. And so identity is not a single uniform relation, but varies depending on what kind of thing is in question. The sock paradox raises questions about artifacts and their relationship to their materials, because unlike natural objects, artifacts are defined partly by their functions and purposes. A sock is not just any piece of fabric, but a piece of fabric designed and shaped to be worn on a foot. And so perhaps what makes a sock the same sock over time is not the persistence of the same material, but the persistence of the same functional structure, the same ability to serve the purpose for which it was made. And if this is right, then the continuously repaired sock remains the original, even after all its material has been replaced. While the reconstructed sock, though made of original material, is a replica rather than the original, because it lacks the continuity of function and use. But this view faces difficulties too, because it seems to make identity depend on extrinsic factors, on how the sock is used and perceived, rather than on intrinsic properties. And it raises the question of whether an artifact that is stored away unused for years ceases to be the same artifact, or whether a sock that is repaired and then used for a completely different purpose, say as a hand puppet, remains the same sock or becomes something else. The paradox also connects to questions about personal attachment and sentimental value, because people often care about particular objects, not merely because of their function, but because of their history, because of the associations and memories attached to them. And so a sock that has been worn for decades may have sentimental value that a newly reconstructed sock, even if materially identical, would not have. And this suggests that identity, at least in the context of personal possessions, is partly constituted by historical and relational properties, by the role the object has played in someone's life. And this relational view of identity implies that the continuously worn sock is the original because it has the right kind of historical connection to the person who owns it, while the reconstructed sock is a mere duplicate, physically similar, but lacking the history that gives the original its significance. The sock paradox also raises issues about vagueness and borderline cases, because in practice the transition from original to replica is not sharp. There is no precise moment when the repaired sock stops being the original and becomes something else. And so perhaps the question of whether it is the same sock admits of no determinate answer. In borderline cases, perhaps identity is vague and the law of excluded middle. The principle that for any proposition, either it or its negation is true, fails for identity statements involving gradual change. The paradox has legal and practical implications as well. In contexts where the identity of an object matters for property rights, warranties, insurance claims, or historical authentication, courts and experts must sometimes decide whether a heavily restored painting or a rebuilt car is the same object as the original or a different object. And these decisions depend on criteria that are often contested, on judgments about how much change an object can undergo while remaining itself. And these judgments reveal that identity is not always a purely factual matter, but involves normative and pragmatic considerations, decisions about what we care about and what purposes our identity judgments are meant to serve. Lockie's sock sits in the drawer, worn and repaired, a humble object that embodies deep philosophical questions, and it reminds us that persistence through time is not as straightforward as common sense suggests, that the boundaries of objects are not fixed by nature, but negotiated through concepts and practices. That identity is a nexus of material, functional, historical, and relational factors, and that the question of whether something is the same thing it was before is often a question without a single correct answer, a question that depends on context, on what aspects of similarity and continuity we privilege, and on whether we are asking about material identity, functional identity, or historical identity. And the sock, like the ship of Theseus, sails on through philosophical discussion, a paradox that will not be mended, a puzzle that remains even after all its threads have been replaced. Newcomb's paradox, A being with perfect or near-perfect predictive abilities presents you with two boxes, one transparent and one opaque. And the rules of the game are simple, but the decision is agonizing. And this is Newcomb's paradox, a thought experiment devised by physicist William Newcomb and popularized by philosopher Robert Nozick that has divided decision theorists and philosophers into rival camps for decades. The transparent box contains $1,000, visible and certain, while the opaque box contains either $1 million or nothing, and the amount depends on a prediction made by the being before you arrived. If the being predicted you would take only the opaque box, then it placed $1 million inside. But if it predicted you would take both boxes, then it left the opaque box empty. The being has made this offer to many people before, and has never been wrong. Its predictions are accurate with such consistency that it seems to know the future, or at least to understand human psychology so deeply that it can foresee choices with near certainty. Now you must decide, do you take only the opaque box, trusting the prediction and hoping for $1 million? Or do you take both boxes, reasoning that whatever is in the opaque box is already determined, and you might as well collect the extra $1,000 from the transparent box? The paradox arises because two different principles of rational decision-making give opposite answers, and both seem compelling. The expected utility calculation favors taking only the opaque box, because if the being is almost always right, then taking only the opaque box gives you a high probability of receiving $1 million, while taking both boxes gives you a high probability of receiving only $1,000, and so the one-box strategy maximizes expected value. But the dominance principle suggests taking both boxes, because at the moment you make your choice, the contents of the boxes are already fixed. The being has already made its prediction and either placed the $1 million or not. And since the past cannot be changed, your decision cannot affect what is in the opaque box. And therefore, taking both boxes gives you $1,000 more than taking only the opaque box. No matter what the opaque box contains, and dominance reasoning says you should always choose the option that does better in every possible state of the world. The paradox forces a choice between two deeply held intuitions about rationality: the idea that rational agents should maximize expected utility, and the idea that rational agents should not leave money on the table when doing so cannot possibly make things worse. Philosophers and decision theorists remain divided. Some are one-boxers who argue that the being's predictive accuracy makes the dominance reasoning irrelevant, that the correlation between your choice and the contents of the box is so strong that you should act as if your decision causally affects the prediction, even though temporally it does not. While others are two boxers who insist that causal reasoning demands taking both boxes, that the prediction is already made and your choice now cannot retroactively change it, and that one-boxers are falling prey to magical thinking, confusing correlation with causation. The paradox also touches on issues of free will and determinism, because if the being can predict your choice with perfect accuracy, then in what sense is the choice free? And if the choice is not free, then what does it mean to deliberate about it? And if determinism is true, does that undermine the concept of rational decision-making altogether? Newcomb's paradox has inspired the development of new decision theories, including causal decision theory, which endorses two-boxing, and evidential decision theory, which endorses one-boxing, as well as more exotic approaches like timeless decision theory and functional decision theory, which attempt to handle cases where agents can predict or simulate each other. The paradox remains unresolved, a strange meeting point of probability, causation, choice, and prediction, a puzzle that reveals how little we understand about what it means to decide, and whether the principles we use to navigate an uncertain world are as solid as we believe, or whether they crumble when pressed against beings who can see through us, who know what we will do before we do it, who turn decision-making into a game where the rules themselves are in question. Moore's paradox. The philosopher G. E. Moore identified a peculiar class of statements that seem absurd or irrational to assert, even though they may be true. And these statements take the form, "It is raining, but I do not believe it is raining," or "I believe it is raining, but it is not raining." And these statements, while not logical contradictions, strike us as deeply strange, as something no rational person would say. And this strangeness is Moore's paradox, a puzzle about the relationship between belief, assertion, and truth that has implications for epistemology, the philosophy of language, and the nature of self-knowledge. Consider the statement, "It is raining, but I do not believe it is raining," and suppose this statement is true. It really is raining, and the speaker genuinely does not believe it. Perhaps they are looking out the window, but not paying attention, or they are in a state of denial. And so the two conjuncts are both true, and there is no logical contradiction. The world can be such that it is raining, and such that someone does not believe it is raining. And yet if someone asserts this statement, if they say out loud, "It is raining, but I do not believe it is raining," the assertion seems absurd, self-defeating, almost incoherent. And the absurdity does not lie in the content of the statement, which may be true, but in the act of asserting it, in the pragmatic dimension of language use. The paradox arises because assertion carries an implicit commitment to belief. When someone asserts that P they normally implicate, even if they do not explicitly state that they believe P, that they take P to be true, and so asserting it is raining implicates that the speaker believes it is raining, but the second conjunct explicitly denies this belief, and so the assertion as a whole both implicates and denies that the speaker believes it is raining. And this creates a pragmatic contradiction, a clash not between the truth conditions of the statement, but between the commitments carried by different parts of the assertion. Ludwig Wittgenstein famously analysed Moore's paradox, arguing that it reveals something important about the grammar of belief, about the way belief and assertion are related. And Wittgenstein suggested that saying, "I believe P," is not a report of an inner mental state, not a description of something going on in the mind, but rather a different way of asserting P, a way of committing oneself to P with a certain degree of caution or tentativeness. And if this is right, then I believe it is raining, but it is not raining is paradoxical because it both asserts and denies the same thing. It commits to the truth of the proposition while simultaneously withdrawing that commitment. Others have analysed the paradox in terms of rational constraints on belief and assertion, arguing that rationality requires a certain coherence between one's beliefs and one's assertions. That if you assert P, you should believe P, and if you believe P, you should regard P as true. And so asserting it is raining, but I do not believe it is raining, violates these coherence requirements. It displays a kind of epistemic irrationality, a failure to properly integrate one's assertions with one's beliefs, even if the statement itself is not logically contradictory. The paradox also has a dual form involving belief rather than assertion. Consider the statement, "I believe it is raining, but it is not raining." And again, this may be true. Someone can believe something false, but believing this conjunction seems irrational, because if you believe the first conjunct, that you believe it is raining, and you also believe the second conjunct, that it is not raining, then you are aware that one of your beliefs is false, yet you continue to hold both beliefs. And this seems like a paradigm case of irrationality, holding contradictory beliefs while being fully aware of the contradiction. The more paradoxical statements reveal a kind of blindness that rational agents have about their own beliefs. You cannot rationally believe I believe P, but not P, even though this statement may be true, because believing it requires simultaneously believing P. Since you believe that you believe P, and beliefs about your own beliefs are generally reliable, and believing not P, which is the second conjunct, and so you end up believing both P and not P, which is a straightforward contradiction. And so the more paradoxical belief collapses into an ordinary contradiction when believed, even though it is not a contradiction when merely entertained or stated by someone else. The paradox connects to issues about self-knowledge and the transparency of belief, the idea that we have a special kind of access to our own mental states, that we know what we believe in a way that is different from how we know what others believe. And Moore's paradox suggests that this access is not merely causal or empirical, but involves a kind of rational or conceptual connection, that there are norms governing the relationship between belief and self-ascription of belief, norms that make certain combinations of beliefs irrational even when they are not logically contradictory. The paradox also appears in contexts involving other propositional attitudes. There are more paradoxical statements involving knowledge, such as P is true, but I do not know it, which seem strange to assert even though they may be true. There are billions of truths that any given person does not know, and there are versions involving desire, intention, and other mental states, each revealing similar tensions between the attitude and the self-ascription of that attitude. Some philosophers have argued that Moore's paradox reveals the limits of a purely truth-conditional semantics, the view that the meaning of a sentence is fully captured by its truth conditions, by the conditions under which it is true or false. Because more paradoxical sentences have clear truth conditions, they are true when both conjuncts are true, and yet they are assertorically defective. They cannot be rationally asserted, and this suggests that meaning involves more than truth conditions, that it includes pragmatic dimensions, norms of assertion, and the commitments that speakers undertake when they use language. Others have explored formal models of Moore's paradox using epistemic logic and doxastic logic, systems that formalize reasoning about knowledge and belief. And these formal models can represent the structure of more paradoxical statements and prove that they are not logically contradictory, while also showing why they lead to incoherence when believed or asserted. And this formal work has illuminated the structure of the paradox and connected it to other puzzles in epistemic logic, such as the knowability paradox and the surprise examination paradox. Moore's paradox remains a touchstone in philosophy of mind and language, a simple puzzle that continues to generate insights about the nature of belief, the norms of assertion, the structure of self-knowledge, and the relationship between logic and rationality. And it stands as a reminder that coherence and consistency are more complex than they first appear, that there are ways of being irrational that do not involve believing logical contradictions, that the pragmatics of language use constrain what can be rationally asserted in ways that go beyond the truth or falsity of what is said, and that the relationship between mind and world, between belief and truth, between what we think and what we say, is mediated by norms and commitments that are not fully captured by the formal apparatus of logic. And the statement sits there: it is raining. But I do not believe it is raining. True perhaps, yet absurd, unsayable, a combination of words that no rational speaker would utter. And the paradox persists, a permanent fixture in the landscape of philosophy, a puzzle that illuminates the boundaries of rational thought, the limits of self-knowledge, and the strange logic that governs the relationship between belief and assertion, between what we think and what we can coherently say about what we think. The arrow paradox. Motion seems so simple, so obvious. An arrow flies through the air from bow to target, and no one doubts that it moves. Yet the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea posed a question that has troubled thinkers for over 2,000 years, a question about whether motion is even possible at all. And this is the arrow paradox, one of Zeno's many arguments against the reality of change and multiplicity. Consider an arrow in flight, frozen at a single instant of time. At that precise moment, the arrow occupies a specific region of space exactly equal to its own length and width. It is not in two places at once. It is simply where it is, motionless, static, indistinguishable from an arrow at rest. At the next instant, the same is true. The arrow occupies a space equal to itself, motionless at that frozen moment, and at the next instant, and the next. And if time is composed of a sequence of such instants, then at every instant the arrow is motionless. And if the arrow is motionless at every instant, then how can it be said to move at all? For motion would require the arrow to be in more than one place at a single instant, or to be in a state of transition rather than a state of rest, and yet at any given instant there is no motion, only position. Zeno used this paradox to support the Eleatic philosophy of Parmenides, which held that change and motion are illusions, that reality is a single, unchanging whole, and that the apparent diversity and movement we perceive are mere deceptions of the senses. The arrow paradox strikes at the very concept of instantaneous velocity, the idea that an object has a speed at a single moment in time, and Aristotle attempted to refute Zeno by arguing that time is not composed of indivisible instants, but is continuous, that motion is not a series of static positions, but a process that unfolds over intervals, and that the paradox arises only if we mistakenly treat time as a collection of frozen moments, rather than a flowing continuum. Modern physics offers a different resolution through calculus, where velocity is defined as the derivative of position with respect to time, a limit that describes how position changes as the time interval approaches zero. And in this framework, instantaneous velocity is a well-defined concept. The arrow does have a speed at each moment, even though speed is not a property that can be observed in a single instant, but only inferred from the relationship between position and time. Yet some philosophers argue that the arrow paradox still points to something genuine and unresolved, a mystery about how the static and the dynamic relate, how a series of stillnesses can add up to motion, how being in a place can somehow become moving between places. Quantum mechanics adds another layer to the puzzle, because at the subatomic level, particles do not have definite positions and velocities simultaneously. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle states that the more precisely we know a particle's position, the less precisely we can know its momentum. And in some sense, the arrow paradox prefigures this strange quantum behavior, the idea that motion and position are not entirely compatible descriptions of reality. The paradox also connects to debates about the nature of time itself, whether time is discrete or continuous, whether it flows or is an illusion, whether the present moment is all that exists or whether past and future are equally real, and whether change is fundamental or derivative. Zeno's arrow hangs suspended in thought, motionless at every instant, yet undeniably in flight, a puzzle that refuses to vanish despite millennia of analysis, a reminder that even the most basic experiences, the flight of an arrow, the passing of time, the reality of motion, rest on assumptions that can be questioned, that beneath the surface of the obvious lies a tangle of conceptual difficulties that no amount of mathematics or physics has entirely smoothed away, and the arrow flies still, or perhaps it never moved at all, frozen forever in the paradox that bears its name. Russell's paradox. In the year 1901, a young mathematician named Bertrand Russell discovered a contradiction so profound that it shattered the foundations of mathematics and forced an entire generation of logicians to rebuild their discipline from the ground up. And this contradiction became known as Russell's paradox, a simple question about sets that revealed a fatal flaw in the way mathematicians understood collections and categories. A set is merely a collection of objects, and sets can contain anything: numbers, colours, ideas, even other sets. And at first this seems harmless enough. A set of all chairs, a set of all prime numbers, a set of all books ever written. Some sets contain themselves as members and some do not. And this too seems straightforward. A catalogue of all catalogues would include itself because it is also a catalogue, while a list of all fruit does not include itself because a list is not a fruit. Russell posed a deceptively innocent question: consider the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Does this set contain itself? And the mind stumbles immediately, into contradiction. If the set contains itself, then by definition it should not contain itself, because the rule states it only includes sets that do not contain themselves. But if it does not contain itself, then it must include itself, because it fits the criteria perfectly. And so the paradox loops without end, a perfect logical knot that cannot be untied. This was not merely a clever riddle or a philosophical curiosity, it was a disaster for mathematics, because at the time, mathematicians believed they could organize all of mathematical knowledge using set theory, a system proposed by Georg Cantor that treated sets as the fundamental building blocks of reality. But Russell's paradox proved that naive set theory was inconsistent, that it allowed contradictions to exist within its structure, and if contradictions are permitted, then anything can be proven true or false, rendering the entire system useless. Russell himself compared the paradox to a barber in a village who shaves all and only those men who do not shave themselves. And the question arises, does the barber shave himself? And if he does, then he should not, because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But if he does not, then he must, because he shaves all men who do not shave themselves. And the loop tightens again. Mathematicians scrambled to patch the damage, and various solutions emerged over the following decades. Zermelo and Frankel developed a new version of set theory that imposed strict rules about which sets could exist, forbidding the kind of self-reference that allowed Russell's paradox to form, while type theory introduced hierarchies that prevented sets from containing themselves by assigning different logical levels to different kinds of objects. Others embraced paraconsistent logic, systems that allow contradictions without collapse, or rejected the entire project of grounding mathematics in set theory, seeking new foundations altogether. Russell's paradox also influenced philosophy beyond mathematics, touching on questions of language, meaning, and self-reference, revealing that not all grammatically correct statements are logically coherent, that some sentences create traps from which reason cannot escape. The paradox appears in unexpected places. In computer science, where recursive definitions can cause programs to crash, in legal systems where laws reference themselves in contradictory ways, in everyday thought whenever categories attempt to classify themselves. It stands as a reminder that even the most rigorous systems of thought contain limits, that logic itself is not immune to paradox, that the quest for certainty and completeness may be forever haunted by statements that twist back on themselves and devour their own meaning. Quine's Gavagai problem? Why we can never know what anyone really means. An anthropologist arrives in a remote village to study an unknown language, a language no outsider has encountered before. And the anthropologist has no translator, no dictionary, no common linguistic framework, only observations and patience, and the method is radical translation. Learning the language from scratch by observing how natives use words in response to events. And one day, a rabbit runs past and a native points and says Gavagai, and the anthropologist writes in the notebook, Gavagai means rabbit. And this seems reasonable, seems like an obvious inference. The native saw a rabbit and said Gavagai, so Gavagai must refer to rabbits. But philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine points out a problem, a deep problem about meaning and translation. Because Gavagai might mean rabbit, but it might also mean undetached rabbit part, or rabbit stage, or collection of rabbit molecules, or instance of rabbithood. And all these translations are consistent with the native's behaviour. All would lead the native to say Gavagai in exactly the same circumstances, whenever a rabbit is present, and there is no fact of the matter, no objective truth about which translation is correct, no way to determine what Gavagai really means. And this indeterminacy is not due to practical limitations, not due to insufficient evidence, but is fundamental, is a consequence of how meaning works. And this is Quine's Gavagai problem, also called the problem of indeterminacy of translation, a challenge to the idea that words have determinate meanings, that translation has right answers and that we can know what others mean when they speak. Imagine trying to distinguish between gavagai means rabbit and gavagai means undetached rabbit part. And you point to the rabbit and the native says gavagai, and you point to the rabbit's ear and ask whether this is gavagai, and the native responds, but you do not know whether the response means yes because the ear is an undetached rabbit part, or no, because the ear is not a whole rabbit, or something else entirely. And every test you design, every question you ask, can be interpreted in multiple ways, can be answered consistently by multiple translations, and no amount of observation, no behavioural evidence can definitively settle which translation is correct, because the native's behaviour under all possible circumstances is compatible with multiple interpretations. And Quine argues that this shows meaning is indeterminate, that there is no fact about what gavagai really means, only different translation manuals that work equally well, that map the native's language onto ours in different but equally legitimate ways. The problem generalizes beyond anthropology to all understanding of language, because even when we share a language, even when we both speak English, the gavagai problem applies. We cannot be certain that we mean the same thing by our words, that rabbit means to you what it means to me. We might be using different concepts, carved up differently, but our behavior is similar enough that we never notice the difference. And this raises the disturbing possibility that communication is always partial, always approximate, that we never fully understand each other, that meaning is not something objective that words have, but something we impose through interpretation, and different interpretations can fit the evidence equally well, and there is no transcendent perspective from which to judge which interpretation is correct. Visualize meaning as a relationship between words and world, and Quine's point is that this relationship is underdetermined by behaviour, by the evidence available to translators, because infinitely many relationships are consistent with the same behavioural evidence. Infinitely many ways of mapping words to world produce the same observable patterns, and choosing among these possibilities requires going beyond evidence, requires making decisions that are not forced by facts, and these decisions constitute meaning rather than discovering it. And so meaning is partially conventional, partially stipulated, not fully determined by reality. The gavagai problem challenges referential theories of meaning, theories that say words mean things because they refer to objects in the world, because rabbit refers to rabbits, and water refers to water, and Quine's argument shows that reference is inscrutable, cannot be determined from behaviour alone, because words can be interpreted as referring to different things, different ways of carving up reality, and all interpretations fit the evidence, and so reference is not an objective relation, but is relative to a translation manual, relative to a scheme of interpretation, and different manuals. Different schemes can assign different references to the same words while remaining equally correct. One response to the gavagai problem accepts the indeterminacy, embraces it as a truth about meaning, argues that Quine is right, that there is no fact of the matter about what words mean beyond what is determined by behavioural evidence, and meaning is holistic, depends on the entire network of beliefs and language practices. And translation manuals are theoretical frameworks that organise this evidence. And like all theories, they are underdetermined by data, and multiple theories fit the same data equally well. And choosing among them involves pragmatic considerations, simplicity, utility, coherence, but not truth in any absolute sense. And this response treats meaning as a human construction, something we create through practices rather than something we discover in nature. Another response denies the indeterminacy, argues that Quine's thought experiment is artificial, that in real translation situations additional evidence is available, evidence about intentions, about how speakers correct each other, about the structure of their conceptual schemes. And this additional evidence narrows down the possibilities, rules out bizarre interpretations like undetached rabbit part, and determines that gavagai means rabbit in the ordinary sense. And while perfect certainty may be impossible, practical determinacy is achievable, and meaning is objective enough for communication to succeed, for translation to have right and wrong answers. And the Gavagai problem is an epistemological worry, a concern about how we know what words mean. But it does not show that words lack determinate meanings, only that discovering those meanings is difficult. A third response appeals to charity, to the principle that we should interpret speakers as making sense, as having coherent beliefs, as speaking truly most of the time. And this principle constrains translation, rules out interpretations that make speakers irrational or massively mistaken. And while charity does not uniquely determine translation, it narrows the range of acceptable interpretations, and combined with simplicity and other pragmatic virtues, it makes translation tractable, makes it possible to arrive at good translations, even if not perfect ones. And this response treats translation as an interpretive practice, guided by norms rather than as a purely empirical investigation, guided only by behavior. The Gavagai problem also connects to broader philosophical issues about realism and anti-realism, about whether there are objective facts independent of our theories and languages. Because if meaning is indeterminate, then perhaps reality itself is indeterminate. Perhaps there is no fact about whether rabbits or undetached rabbit parts exist, only different ways of organizing experience, different conceptual schemes that carve up the world differently. And Quine's ontological relativity, his claim that what objects exist is relative to a language or theory, follows from the Gavagai problem, from the recognition that reference is inscrutable, that we cannot say what exists absolutely, but only what exists relative to a framework. The anthropologist sits with a notebook, the word Gavagai recorded, the translation uncertain, and the native speaks, and the anthropologist interprets, and communication proceeds approximately, pragmatically, successfully enough for practical purposes. And whether Gavagai really means rabbit or something else remains undetermined, remains a question without an answer. And Quine's problem persists, not as a practical obstacle to translation, but as a philosophical challenge to theories of meaning, as a demonstration that meaning is more elusive than we thought, more dependent on interpretation and less determined by facts. And the Gavagai problem endures as one of Quine's most influential contributions, a thought experiment that changed how philosophers think about language, about meaning, about translation, and about the relationship between words and world. And the problem remains unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, a permanent feature of linguistic philosophy, a reminder that understanding each other is harder than it seems, that meaning is indeterminate, that communication is an achievement rather than an automatic consequence of shared language, and that the gap between what we say and what we mean, between our words and their reference, can never be fully closed. And the rabbit runs past and the native says, Gavagai, and we translate approximately, hopefully, never quite certain that we have understood. Synesthesia. Paradox. Why numbers have colours and sounds have tastes. A person looks at the number 5 and sees it as blue, not imagines it as blue, not associates it with blue, but actually sees blue, experiences colour as an intrinsic property of the number. And another person hears music and tastes chocolate, hears certain chords, and the taste appears involuntarily, automatically. And these experiences are synesthesia, are cross-modal sensory experiences where stimulation in one modality produces perception in another. And synesthesia is not metaphor, is not learned association, is a genuine perceptual phenomenon experienced by roughly 4% of the population. And the paradox is that synesthetes experience properties that are not physically present, see colours that are not in the stimulus, taste flavours that have no source, and yet these experiences are consistent, are reliable. The same numbers always evoke the same colours, the same sounds always evoke the same tastes, and this reliability distinguishes synesthesia from imagination or association, shows that synesthesia is automatic, is perceptual rather than cognitive, and the phenomenon reveals something fundamental about how the brain is organized, shows that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, but can communicate, can influence each other, and synesthesia represents an extreme of this cross-modal interaction, represents a neural architecture where connections between sensory areas are stronger than normal, are sufficient to produce conscious experiences in one modality when another is stimulated. Imagine being a grapheme color synesthete, the most common form where letters and numbers evoke colors, and you read this text and every letter has its own color. A is red, B is green, C is yellow, and the colors are vivid, are as clear as real colors, are not vague or imagined but are perceptually present. And when you see the letter A, you cannot help but see red. The color is automatic, is triggered by the visual form of the letter, and this coloring happens for all letters and numbers, creates a richly colored experience of reading. And while this might sound beautiful, it can also be distracting, can interfere with reading when the printed colors conflict with synesthetic colors, can create confusion. And yet for synesthetes, this is normal, is how the world has always looked. And they're often surprised to learn that others do not experience letters as colored, that the colors are unique to synesthetes. Synesthesia demonstrates that perception is not modular, is not strictly segregated by sensory modality, and in synesthetes there is cross-activation. There are connections between sensory areas that do not exist or are weaker in non-synesthetes, and these connections allow activity in one area to trigger activity in another. And when grapheme area, the region that processes letter and number shapes, is activated, it also activates color area, the region that processes color, and this cross-activation produces the experience of colored letters. And neuroimaging studies have confirmed this, have shown that when synesthetes see numbers, color areas of visual cortex are activated, are lit up, and this activation is automatic, is bottom-up, is not produced by conscious thought or imagination, but is triggered by the stimulus itself. Visualize the brain as having sensory areas that are normally separate: visual area, auditory area, taste area, and these areas process their respective inputs and pass information to higher level regions. But in synesthetes there are additional connections. There are pathways between sensory areas that allow direct crosstalk, and these pathways are the neural basis of synesthesia, are what allows stimulation in one modality to produce experiences in another. And the connections are not learned, are not created through experience, but are developmental, are present from early life. And synesthesia is lifelong, is consistent. The same cross-modal experiences occurring throughout the synesthete's life. The synesthesia paradox is that these experiences are perceptual, are as real as any other perception, and yet the properties perceived are not present in the stimulus. The number 5 is not blue, is black on white, and yet the synesthete sees blue. And this challenges theories that say perception is veridical, is accurate, is a representation of physical reality. And synesthesia shows that perception can include properties that are not in the world, that are generated internally, and yet these properties feel external, feel like properties of objects rather than like internal mental states. And this raises questions about the nature of perception, about what it means for perception to be of something, about whether all perception involves some degree of construction, some degree of adding properties that are not in the stimulus. One theory of synesthesia is that everyone is born with extensive cross-modal connections, that infant brains have connections between all sensory areas, and during development, most of these connections are pruned or eliminated, and sensory areas become more segregated. And in synesthetes, some of these early connections are preserved, are not pruned, and this preservation allows the cross-modal experiences to continue into adulthood. And this theory is supported by evidence that infants show some synesthetic effects, show cross-modal correspondences, and that synesthesia runs in families, has a genetic component, suggesting that genes that regulate synaptic pruning are involved. Another theory is that synesthesia involves disinhibition, involves normally present connections between sensory areas that are usually inhibited, are suppressed, and in synesthetes this inhibition is weakened, is less effective, and so the connections are active, allow cross-activation, and this theory is supported by evidence that synesthesia can be induced temporarily in non-synesthetes through drugs that reduce inhibition, through hypnosis, through sensory deprivation, suggesting that the neural machinery for synesthesia is present in everyone, but is normally inhibited, and synesthetes have less inhibition, have more open channels between sensory areas. Synesthesia also has practical implications. Some synesthetes report that their experiences are useful, provide memory aids, make information more distinctive, easier to remember, and some musicians with sound-colour synesthesia report that the colours help with composition, with understanding musical structure, and some artists deliberately cultivate synesthetic experiences, use them as sources of creativity. And understanding synesthesia has implications for education, for recognising that people process information differently, that sensory experiences vary across individuals, and that teaching should accommodate these differences, should recognise that some students have richly coloured experiences of letters and numbers, while others do not. The phenomenon also raises questions about consciousness, about qualia, about the subjective properties of experience, because synesthetes have different qualia than non-synesthetes, have colour experiences that others do not, and this shows that consciousness is not uniform, is not the same across individuals, and qualia vary, and this variation is not just quantitative, is not just more or less of the same experience, but is qualitative, involves entirely different types of experience, and this challenges theories that say all consciousness is universal, is the same for everyone, and supports theories that say consciousness is individual, is constructed by each brain in potentially different ways. And synesthesia is one example of this variation, is one way that consciousness can differ. Some philosophers argue that synesthesia shows that perception is not representational, does not represent external properties, because the colours seen by graphema colour synesthetes do not represent anything in the world. The number 5 is not blue, and yet the colour is perceived, and this challenges representational theories of perception, suggests that perceptual experiences are not always representations of external properties but can be internally generated responses. And synesthesia is a case where the response includes properties that are not being represented, and this raises questions about what makes perception representational, whether all aspects of perception are representations or whether some are merely responses are produced by the perceptual system without representing anything external. The number appears black on white, and the synesthete sees blue, vivid and automatic. The colour is as real as the number, is as perceptually present, and yet the colour is not there, is not in the stimulus, is generated by the brain, is a cross-modal activation, and the synesthesia paradox remains. Perception includes non-veridical properties, includes experiences that do not correspond to stimulus properties, and yet these experiences are automatic, are reliable, are as perceptually real as any other, and synesthesia endures as one of the most fascinating phenomena in neuroscience, a demonstration that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, that cross-modal connections exist, that perception can include internally generated properties, and that consciousness varies across individuals, includes experiences that are unique, that are not shared by everyone, and the colours remain overlaid on letters, triggered by sounds, evoked by tastes, and the cross-modal world of synesthetes continues, different from the world non-synesthetes perceive, richer in some ways, more confusing in others, and the phenomenon persists. The analysis paradox. Philosophy has long been concerned with analysis, with taking complex concepts and breaking them down into simpler components, with providing definitions that specify the necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of a term. And this project of conceptual analysis seems both important and straightforward. We want to know what knowledge is, what justice is, what truth is, and we proceed by analysing these concepts, by stating explicitly what they mean, by giving definitions that capture their essential features. Yet there is a paradox lurking here, a puzzle about whether analysis is even possible. And this is the paradox of analysis, first articulated clearly by C.H. Langford, and discussed extensively by G.E. Moore and others in the early 20th century. The paradox can be stated simply. Suppose we offer an analysis of some concept. For example, we might analyse the concept brother as male sibling, and this analysis, if correct, should be informative, should tell us something we did not already know about what brotherhood consists in, should illuminate the concept by making its structure explicit. But if the analysis is correct, then the analysandum, the concept being analysed, and the analysans, the analysis itself, must have the same meaning. They must be synonymous, otherwise the analysis would be incorrect. It would not capture what brotherhood really is. And if they are synonymous, then the statement brother means male sibling should be trivial, should be like saying brother means brother, a mere tautology that provides no new information. And so the analysis cannot be both correct and informative. If it is correct, then it is trivial. And if it is informative, then it is not a genuine analysis, but merely a stipulation or a proposed change of meaning. The paradox threatens the entire project of conceptual analysis, because it suggests that analysis cannot do what it is supposed to do, cannot both correctly identify the meaning of a concept and provide new insight into that meaning, cannot be both true and interesting. And so either conceptual analysis is impossible, or our understanding of what analysis is and what it aims to achieve must be revised. One response to the paradox distinguishes between sense and reference, between the meaning of a term and what it picks out, and argues that an analysis can be informative even if the analysandum and analysans refer to the same thing, because they can differ in sense, in the way they present or describe that thing. And so the analysis brother means male sibling is informative, because even though brother and male sibling refer to the same set of individuals, they present that set in different ways, one as a family relation and the other as a combination of gender and kinship. And this difference in sense makes the identity statement informative rather than trivial. Another response appeals to a distinction between conceptual and factual knowledge, arguing that analysis does not provide factual knowledge about the world, but conceptual knowledge about our own concepts, that it makes explicit what was already implicit in our understanding, that it brings to consciousness the structure of concepts that we already possess and use, but have not fully articulated. And so, the informativeness of analysis is not the informativeness of discovering new facts, but the informativeness of self-clarification, of making our own conceptual commitments explicit and transparent. A third response associated with Quine and others skeptical of the analytic-synthetic distinction denies that there is a sharp line between conceptual analysis and empirical investigation, arguing that all beliefs form a holistic web where conceptual revisions and factual discoveries are intertwined, and that what we call analysis is really just careful reflection on our current best theory of the world, subject to revision in light of new evidence or theoretical considerations. And on this view, the paradox dissolves, because analysis is not supposed to be a priori or purely conceptual, but is continuous with empirical inquiry, and so it can be both correct and informative without any mystery. The paradox also raises questions about the methodology of philosophy, about whether philosophy can make progress through analysis or whether some other method is needed. And different philosophical traditions have taken different stances, with analytic philosophy traditionally emphasizing conceptual analysis as a central tool, while continental philosophy has been more skeptical of analysis, focusing instead on interpretation, critique, and phenomenological description, and the paradox of analysis has been one factor driving some philosophers away from traditional analysis toward other approaches. The paradox connects to issues about understanding and competence because we seem to have a kind of implicit or tacit understanding of concepts like knowledge, justice, and truth. We can use these concepts correctly, can apply them to particular cases, can recognize when they are used inappropriately, and yet when asked to state explicitly what these concepts mean, to provide a definition, we struggle. And this suggests that conceptual competence does not require explicit knowledge of definitions, that understanding can be practical and procedural rather than theoretical and propositional, and that analysis attempts to convert implicit understanding into explicit knowledge, a conversion that is difficult and perhaps impossible to complete without remainder. The paradox also appears in the context of philosophical disagreement, because philosophers have been offering analyses of key concepts for millennia, and yet consensus remains elusive. Different philosophers provide different analyses of knowledge, of justice, of truth, and it is not always clear how to adjudicate between competing analyses, whether by appeal to intuitions about particular cases, by considerations of theoretical simplicity and fruitfulness, or by some other standard. And the lack of agreement raises the question of whether these concepts have determinate meanings that analysis can discover, or whether they are vague, contested, or essentially contested, such that no single analysis could capture all the ways they are legitimately used. The analysis paradox remains a puzzle at the heart of philosophy, a question about what philosophy is doing when it offers definitions and analyses, whether it is discovering pre-existing meanings, stipulating new ones, or engaging in some more complex activity that combines elements of discovery, stipulation, and rational reconstruction, and the paradox has not been definitively resolved. Different philosophers find different responses more or less compelling, and the debate continues, with implications for how we understand the nature and methods of philosophical inquiry. And the concept sits there, waiting to be analysed, inviting us to state its essence, to specify its conditions, to make explicit what we already implicitly know, and yet the analysis, when offered, seems either to tell us nothing new or to change the subject, to offer a different concept rather than clarifying the original one. And the paradox persists, a thorn in the side of analysis, a reminder that understanding is more elusive than it appears, that the gap between knowing how to use a concept and knowing what it means is wider than we thought, and that philosophy, despite its ancient commitment to clarity and definition, to making the implicit explicit and the confused clear, may be chasing a goal that is inherently problematic, inherently paradoxical, a goal that recedes as we approach it, that becomes more obscure the more we try to illuminate it, and yet we continue to analyse, to offer definitions, to seek clarity, because the alternative, giving up on understanding, seems worse. The bootstrap paradox. There exists a strange loop in time where cause and effect chase each other in a circle, where information or objects appear from nowhere, with no origin, no creator, no beginning, and this is the bootstrap paradox, named after the impossible act of pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps, a paradox that emerges whenever time travel creates a causal loop that has no starting point. Imagine a time traveller who loves a particular symphony, and one day they decide to travel back in time to meet the composer, but when they arrive in the past, they discover that the composer has not yet written the symphony, and so the time traveller, eager to hear the music again, writes down the notes from memory and gives them to the composer, who then publishes it as their own work, and the symphony becomes famous, and years later the time traveller hears it and falls in love with it and decides to travel back in time to meet the composer, and the loop is complete. The question that haunts this scenario is simple and unanswerable. Who actually composed the symphony? The composer received it from the time traveler, and the time traveler received it from the composer, and neither of them created it. The information simply exists within the loop, passed from future to past and back again, with no point of origin, no moment of creation, no author. The bootstrap paradox differs from the grandfather paradox because it does not involve contradiction. The timeline is perfectly self-consistent. Every event follows logically from every other event. There is no clash between cause and effect, and yet something feels deeply wrong, an intuition that things must come from somewhere. That information cannot simply exist without being created. The paradox appears in many variations: a book that writes itself, a watch that is given to a younger version of oneself, who then keeps it for decades before giving it back, a technology that is brought from the future and used to invent itself, and in each case the object or information becomes eternal, trapped in a loop of time, aging perhaps, but never truly beginning or ending. Some physicists accept the bootstrap paradox as a genuine possibility if time travel is real, arguing that closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that loop back on themselves, are permitted by general relativity under certain conditions, and that such loops might allow for causally self-sufficient systems where the past and future are mutually dependent. Others find the paradox deeply troubling, a sign that something is wrong with our understanding of causation, entropy, or time itself, because information in a loop would violate the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always increases, that order does not arise spontaneously from disorder, and yet in a bootstrap loop, the information appears to be perfectly preserved, never degrading, never increasing in entropy, existing in a kind of timeless stasis. The many worlds interpretation offers one way out, suggesting that the time traveler who delivers the symphony creates a new branch of reality, and that in their original timeline, the symphony had a different origin, but this solution feels like cheating, multiplying universes to avoid the discomfort of the loop. The bootstrap paradox forces confrontation with deep questions about the nature of causation, whether causes must always precede effects, whether the universe permits closed causal loops, and whether existence itself requires an ultimate origin, or whether some things can simply be eternal and self-caused, through time without beginning or end, defying the intuition that everything must come from something, that there must always be a first cause, a prime mover, a starting point from which all else flows. The barber paradox. In a small village, there lives a barber who follows a single rule. He shaves all and only those men in the village who do not shave themselves. And this rule seems simple enough until the question emerges: does the barber shave himself? And suddenly the logic collapses into contradiction. If the barber shaves himself, then he belongs to the group of men who shave themselves, which means according to the rule, he should not shave himself because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then he belongs to the group of men who do not shave themselves, which means according to the rule, he must shave himself because he shaves all men who do not shave themselves, and the loop tightens without escape, spinning endlessly between two impossible options. Bertrand Russell popularized this version of his own paradox as a way to make the abstract problem of self-referential sets more accessible, more human, more vivid, because a barber is easier to imagine than a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Yet the logical structure remains identical, a rule that turns inward and devours its own coherence. The paradox reveals something unsettling about definitions and categories, that not all rules can be consistently applied, that language and logic can conspire to create situations that seem perfectly reasonable until examined closely, and then they shatter. Some philosophers argue that the barber simply cannot exist, that the rule itself is contradictory, and therefore no such barber could ever follow it in reality, while others suggest that the problem lies in assuming the rule must apply universally, that perhaps the barber is exempt from his own rule, or that the village contains no barber at all. The paradox also exposes the danger of self-reference, the way that statements or rules that loop back on themselves can generate infinite regress or outright contradiction. And this has implications far beyond barbershops, touching mathematics, computer science, law, and any system that attempts to regulate itself from within. In set theory, the barber paradox mirrors Russell's discovery that naive set theory permits the construction of sets that cannot exist without contradiction, forcing mathematicians to impose restrictions on which sets are allowed to form, creating hierarchies and boundaries to prevent self-reference from poisoning the system. The barber stands at the edge of reason, a figure trapped in a loop of his own making, unable to shave or not shave without violating the very rule that defines his existence, and in this way, he becomes a symbol of the limits of logic, a reminder that not every question has an answer, that some problems resist resolution no matter how carefully they are examined. The paradox lingers in the mind, a simple story about a man and a razor that somehow reveals a crack in the foundation of thought itself, and once noticed, it cannot be ignored, appearing again and again wherever rules turn inward, wherever systems attempt to contain themselves, wherever language reaches the boundary of what it can coherently express.